Thank you all for staying throughout all of the presentations today, especially to the final presentation that has to do with Jetpack Compose at an iOS conference. What a way to end the conference. But no, really, thank you for staying, and I am really excited to talk to you about Jetpack Compose, but I really don't want you to be afraid of this title. We are going to talk about SwiftUI and hopefully come to some resolutions at the end where we can kind of come together to a consensus on everything in between. So who's speaking to you today? Hey, I'm Erica. I am a technical lead manager at Slack. I work primarily on iOS, but I like to consider myself a mobile engineer. I work on iOS, Android, sometimes a little bit of backend. And yeah, I've been at Slack for the last 5 or so, well, there's a story behind that. But anyways, I've worked at Slack for a while, so if you have any questions, I'm gonna look at everybody's phone to make sure everybody has the app downloaded. You're in the conference Slack. If you have bugs, DM me. And I want to go into a little bit of a backstory about how I got into iOS development, and what made me really excited was the first time I had gone to a WWDC conference. And who here has been to maybe one of those conferences before? If you ever have the chance, they're a lot of fun, a great way to meet a lot of people. And I was lucky enough to go as an intern with the startup that I was working at the time, and you know, in true startup form, I went with a team where we only had one ticket for a bunch of folks, and so I went into this conference as Sean. And as an intern, of course, new to iOS development, I was very nervous to go into WWDC. I tried to put on my most confident face possible, walk in. Of course, security didn't really care too much. I got in, was having a great time, was going to a bunch of sessions, and in true form, there was like celebrities walking around, and one of those people who happened to be walking around was Craig. And I was an intern. I had to take the opportunity, so I stopped him to ask for a photo. He was gracious enough. We have the photo here today. He looked over at me and he said, "Thank you so much for coming to the conference, Sean. I hope you have a great time." I was not going to correct him. I promptly ran away. There's a group of people starting to ask for more photos. I was gone. But I have the photo. So, Craig, if you're watching, my name's not Sean. I'm Erica, and I am still an iOS developer. A little context of how I got into the topic that I'm speaking about today. Well, about a year and a half ago, I got interested in the idea of becoming a TLM at Slack, where I got to manage and code and kind of do a lot of the in-between stuff. And I was gifted with this wonderful team that had both iOS and Android developers. And if you can see by my lovely emoji usage here, there's a little bit more of a skew towards iOS developers. And in true form, I tried to be the good TLM, and I tried to get a little bit of empathy with our Android developers, so I started to invest time into working into our Android code base. That proved to be a little bit of an uphill battle, but I did start to invest some time into learning Compose, because at the time, and still today, we were starting to migrate into Circuit and Compose. And so now I was like wondering about all the different intricacies of Compose, and you're going to hear a little bit about that today in my talk. So I want to just break down what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about what are you going to learn from all of this. And I'm going to give you a brief on SwiftUI. I know we've had quite a bit of talks that include SwiftUI, but I also realize that a lot of folks who maybe work at larger companies, or maybe have just not gotten there, or maybe have chosen a project in UIKit because of maybe performance reasons or other concerns, I got you. We're going to go into a little bit of SwiftUI. Then, of course, dun dun dun, talk about Jetpack Compose. We're going to go into a little bit of the similarities and differences of the two, talk a little bit about what's great, what works well, what's still kind of happening, and then understand the strengths of SwiftUI, dive into Compose's strengths, hint there are some, I promise, and then leave you with maybe some thoughts of where you can go with this after, based on your new knowledge of Compose. All right, so I want to start with the idea that when you see these tools maybe like side by side, or you've been in the code bases, There's a lot of bits that feel like they're really kind of converging on some common themes. We'll go into some similarities of the different tools, and you'll kind of understand what's happening there, but I think it's a cool path that we're taking for mobile app development, and I think it makes it a really interesting adventure for what you might want to decide within your own code base. Then I want to kind of give some understanding to the barriers of entry. Some of those will be highlighted in the differences. Some of them are things that maybe you all have encountered before, but it does prove some of the places that could use some improvements in what we do for each platform. And then simply just take a walk in the other person's IDE. Try to understand where they're coming from, especially with Compose, where we might be going. I know there have been a few talks mentioning Kotlin multi-platform, so maybe this could spark an idea for what you might want to think about. All right, for the fun part, let's talk about SwiftUI. So the first thing I love to tell people, whether it's like my back-end friends or my front-end friends or anybody who maybe has somewhat of an interest and understands what SwiftUI is I like to tell them that it's a cool new UI tool for iOS development. You kind of sweep away the old UI kit, you bring in this fun new fancy tool, it's all shiny and sparkly. So let's take a step back and say we're building out a label. In UIKit land, we're going to create the label, we're going to set all the properties, we're going to decide what we want it to look like, we might make some changes, have to recompile, build, the whole process. Looks pretty familiar, very normal. Same idea in SwiftUI, and I don't know about you, but it just feels nice. Everything feels readable, the chaining feels correct, everything just looks how it should. But if you'll notice, if you've ever started to work through SwiftUI, there's this new component to it where SwiftUI is declarative. What is declarative? Well, UIKit is imperative. And if we want to take a look at UIKit first and thinking about the imperative, well, let's see an example. So say you're creating a switch in your application and UIKit, and you want to maintain the state of that switch. You're going to create 2 states, on and off, and for those states, you're going to think about, well, okay, I'm maintaining the state, so I know what's happening, and so I'm going to write the code for if-else statements and all that stuff to set up my switch. It's very hands-on. You're really doing all the work. You're making sure that UIKit is handling everything properly, but UIKit is really just the mechanism to process what you're doing, and you're making all the changes, you're doing all the state management. Well, let's say you get to this state where you're building a big house. There's lots of light switches, and now maybe some light switches should control others, maybe you have some dimmers, maybe one controls all of them. It's getting a little chaotic. And so what SwiftUI can do is have, in the declarative, you kind of write more of a manual instead of writing instruction or maintaining all that state yourself. And then SwiftUI maintains that state. So now you have this process where you can kind of spend a little bit more time defining what that manual might be rather than each step of the process and maintaining that state. It takes out some of the confusion and some of those layers that make it a little bit more difficult to process. I think something very underrated about talking about SwiftUI is that it just feels very simple, a very nice way to process your code. And I'd say Swift is already very nice in itself, so this is just kind of the cherry on top. But if we look at maybe an example of a table view, a lot of people have written probably many, many table views. You use all this boilerplate, you have to set up all your delegates, you really have to do a lot to kind of get a bare minimum table view going. And maybe you've set up some abstractions, and this is really only just a fraction of what you might do to set up your table view. Well, anybody who's created a list before, maybe you've started to look at SwiftUI, and in SwiftUI, you have really this nice, just like, wow, it's a list, and everything seems really taken care of for you, and that's great. So I think this simpler style just feels wonderful. So what else does SwiftUI have? Well, there's a new way of handling updates. So maybe you've used property wrappers, you've seen things like state, observable object. You're able to see updates to your project as you're writing them. If you've been able to experience previews, it feels really exciting to see those incremental updates every time you make a change. And you're using all Swift all the time. It feels really great. And I know we've had this moment where UI kit, you could bridge Objective-C and Swift and kind of do all the things you need to do. Hopefully no one's still using Objective-C, but I understand. And in Swift UI, it kind of is like a forcing mechanism. So it kind of makes sense to be able to be in that full Swift state. All right, now let's talk about Jetpack Compose. I also similarly like to tell people, if they've never worked on Jetpack Compose, that it is a cool new UI tool for Android development. But I don't know, we're skeptical. We got to figure this out. So if you never worked fully as an Android engineer, there's a lot of, let's call it fun setup to be able to create different views. And this is just even like part of it if you want to create a label like this. You have to do a lot of setup with your fragments and your XML files, and we just don't want to look into that anymore. So I feel really thankful that I jumped into learning about Compose at a time where I could jump into Android development where I could use Compose. Because if you see here, now we want to try to create the same label. We have this nice text element. Similarly, setting up our text, the colors, and all of that, and it feels very straightforward. This cool new UI tool for Android also has some nifty ways to annotate code. There's lots of annotations like composable if you want to make sure that you're doing things with Compose, the preview if you want to set up previews that you're going to use, maybe you'll check them in. Preview light dark if you want to specify that you're doing a preview and you want to see it in light mode and dark mode. Opt-in, your custom annotation, you name it. There's lots of ways for Jetpack Compose to be annotated in the functionalities that you build. Just an example of like how you might use those, you just add them right above your function. Probably create it private because I don't know if you're going to want to check in that preview, but you can see it's pretty straightforward with how you use these. And Jetpack Compose is declarative also. Interesting. Keep that noted for later. The updates in Jetpack Compose for how you relay out code goes through recomposition. So thinking about if you're building that tree, everything in the leaf nodes, you make an update, send in a new input, make sure it's mutable, then all of the changes happen through a recomposition process. Everything's all Kotlin. I don't think there's going to be a way for you to do anything with Java with Compose. But I mean, never say never. There's an open source community. They could probably do whatever they want if they put their mind to it. But for now, everything's all Kotlin all the time. All right. So we have a little bit of context on SwiftUI, a little bit of context on Jetpack Compose. Let's talk about the similarities and differences, starting with the similarities. So both SwiftUI and Compose take advantage of modifiers. Modifiers are really powerful in these UI design tools. If you've ever been, I mean, this on the left, the screenshot there, you probably seem pretty familiar with, maybe just scrolling through all the properties you can use with autocomplete. You can get pretty comfortable with trying to find the different modifiers that you want, similarly for SwiftUI. So when you're chaining all of those different properties, you'll kind of step through and make sure you figure out which ones you want to use. Maybe you don't know the name, and so you'll be able to use that. But it makes it really powerful for how you want to put your views together. Maybe you have to learn some understanding of the order, or maybe how to use some of them, but at the end of the day, having these modifiers makes it very powerful how you're going to edit your text elements or any of your UI elements. Similarly, Compose has modifiers. And this is just a snippet of the API for one of the modifiers, but I've heard from some Android developers as maybe not so hot take that there's probably a modifier for everything. So again, similar to what you're doing when you scroll through the autocomplete answers on SwiftUI, there's probably a modifier out there to find something to modify your elements in Compose. Previews. Let's talk about previews. I think something that SwiftUI and Compose both really have here is the ability to have these like full, very rich experiences when you're developing in your environments, making the IDEs feel not just very useful, but it feels like a good place for iteration, good way for you to really like understand what you're doing within your code in real time. When you look at the preview on iOS, it really feels so rich. You have all the capabilities, you're able to interact with everything, it feels like your app, which it should, which is great. And similarly, when you create a preview in Compose, you have this idea of kind of setting up the function. You may set up the view and however you want. And I think that it's nifty because when you set up the preview here in Compose, you can almost use it as kind of maybe like a functional or integration test. So if you maybe don't have manual QA or you just want more ways to be able to interact with how you might test your code, it's a very nice way to just set up lots of different use cases. You kind of make as many of these as you want and set up various examples. Again, going back to the light-dark situation and just kind of figure out what you want to do there. I feel like the readable syntax is going to come up as a theme here. Both of these feel very straightforward. Lots of other developers can come in, they can read the syntax, they can kind of understand where you're going to go with a language, and maybe just like piece it together as a sentence rather than foreign components. So if we take a look example, we're building a button. In SwiftUI, we're going to see we have these button elements. In Compose, we have the button elements. We have some sort of way to interact with the button, and then we're going to set it up with some text inside of the component. Looks pretty standard. They are both, again, declarative. I would also say they have a learning curve. I know that a lot of people here are probably very familiar with Swift and moving over to SwiftUI, so I'd add that moving over to SwiftUI doesn't just feel like, oh, I'm still writing Swift and still writing UI. It's like understanding, again, the declarative syntax, understanding how you update everything with state, bindings, property wrappers, all of those things. And similarly with Compose, there's a new understanding for how you're going to do things, make sure that it's mutable, make sure you can send in the right inputs and the recomposition happens correctly. But on the other side of that, once you do understand, I think it takes you significantly less time than the predecessors. So thinking about how we used to make things with UIKit, thinking about how we used to make things with XML. Just lots of great ways to kind of move things forward, improve the development process, and really just kind of make it iterative and have a great way for you to spend more time building rather than figuring out all these minute details. All right, let's jump into the differences. SwiftUI is built with Swift and Compose with Kotlin. Feels like an obvious one, but it's worth pointing out. I think you'll notice, I think it was pointed out in one of the talks yesterday, that if you read them, they seem pretty similar, but if you look at more of the syntactical things, there are some minute differences that mean you can't just copy and paste backwards. So again, if we're making our button, you see our SwiftUI, we have a button, an action. We have some of the open and close parens. And with Compose, we have an onClick method. And again, a different spot for some of those open, close parens. So just some of those minute details where you see how you're creating the text, where you set the text, and the differences between SwiftUI and Compose. Generally, just those minute details that you'll find when you're working with different languages. A lot of the time I find when working with SwiftUI, there's a little bit more of an implicit style, and Compose a little bit more of an explicit. And you'll see what I mean when I look at this example. So we're sticking with our button. And if you look here, we're creating the button with button text. The background's going to be blue. You look at Compose, similarly we're setting button text, but there's a little bit more of like stated versus understated implicit style that SwiftUI has. I'm not saying one's better than the other. Maybe. And again, with the colors, you see that we have a little bit more of like, maybe I know this is already a color because it says foreground color. But there's just a little bit more nuance, and maybe it's nice so you can kind of read that intuitively and see, okay, color.white, that is a color. Continuing our differences with handling their preview setup differently. Setting up previews, again, the previews are really powerful, and how you can interact and do iterative changes makes a really big change in how you build things. So looking at this example that I have here, I want to lean into the light-dark method or annotation that Compose has. And so when you use this light-dark annotation, it's pretty simple. You just add the view that you want to build with, any inputs, anything you want to change, and now you have all these different examples in your IDE ready to go. And if you want to do something similar with SwiftUI, it takes a little bit more of, I wouldn't say hand-holding, but definitely a little bit more modification for how you want to set those up. I think it's maybe speaks to SwiftUI being a little bit more of that like dynamic moving, lots of parts that you can interact with, touch and things like that. But there's probably elements that you could take and work with in other ways. SwiftUI has property wrappers. So thinking about things like, again, state, observable object, the ways that you're going to update your UI, and how you make sure that that diffing process is very efficient. Compose relies on more of those like annotations, the input values, so making sure that you know what the state of the component is, and if you do want to modify it, you want that recomposition to happen or not. All right, we've kind of gone into the similarities, differences, but I really want to lean into what the strengths of SwiftUI that it has. Apple is pretty Apple, and it's pretty neat to see all of the consistency and the attention that Apple puts into not just the products that it has, but also the products it delivers to developers. So the ecosystem that we have and being able to develop within that ecosystem is very neat. It feels very strong. The culture is very intuitive, and I feel like you know what you're going to get when you work with an Apple product, and it feels very evident. The previews within SwiftUI feel incredible. It feels like you can prototype all the time, and if you're someone like me who likes to work with an iterative approach, not having to recompile, rebuild, have to deal with all the issues that you might have every single time, it feels very like your app is there. It feels great. SwiftUI also has this component of more of like a black box type of way of working, where a lot of things are done for you. So again, thinking back to like when you work with SwiftUI and you have things that kind of get processed, or maybe the diffing happens without you really understanding what's happening. There's not a lot of understanding of where the components are getting that knowledge. It just kind of, it works. Things happen, or maybe it doesn't work and they're gonna fix it. What does Compose have that is really strong here? I found that if you already start to understand Kotlin, working with Compose feels very natural. You'll kind of move towards it very swiftly. You'll have this kind of, you just write a function and it kind of already works. Just have to make sure you add your annotations. But understanding Kotlin gets you really far with Compose. I do think Compose adoption feels very straightforward in a code base that's migrating from one tool to the other. So kind of going from the old to the new, Compose has definitely an edge in how we work with the integration, and it seems very seamless with how Compose can work in a code base with the cross-tool collaboration. Open source. I know we have this little open source project with Swift. Very exciting. I think a lot of people love that we're kind of moving towards that direction, but Apple obviously still has the keys to the castle in lots of aspects, especially with SwiftUI. Compose does not. So if you don't understand how something's working, you can go find out. Or if you want another modifier, you could make that modifier, something that you don't see already. It's very powerful and creates this really great dev community around all of the tools that are within the tool itself. All right, what can we learn from Compose, and where do we take this? As you notice, SwiftUI and Compose have a lot of similarities. They may stretch in some areas, but it's good to understand where we're coming from, how these tools are converging, and honestly, maybe it gives you a little bit of an idea that maybe mobile can be a little bit more fluid. Maybe instead of having this idea of an iOS engineer and Android engineer, you have a mobile engineer. And I'm not necessarily saying like React Native, I'm not necessarily saying shared code, I'm not necessarily saying like combine the whole world, but I actually think having these tools could make it easier for people to just bridge across and be two native apps and have developers work across the code base. I also think there's a lot of empathy and understanding where everybody's coming from. Maybe you have a teammate that goes on a trip and you can help review the code for that project. Maybe you can help that designer who wants to make an animation for your app get involved with SwiftUI so they can start to tweak things, and you can be right there with them. There's a lot of aspects of how we can kind of come together and really break some of those barriers for people to come into mobile development. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can kind of be mobile engineers and really take things forward from what we're learning from Compose and how SwiftUI is coming together. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Erica. Let's see if there are any questions. Hands up or pants down. No, that's what we say as kids in Denmark. I don't know. You say that in any other countries? I don't know. No. Any questions? Sorry, like real questions.
I'll be on Slack. It's all good.
On Slack?
I'll be on
I
Slack.
haven't heard of it. Good. Well, that's awesome. Well, thank you very much.